Ross, and today we're going to be covering the study by Andrade, which is on doodling. This is once again under the cognitive chapter in your psychology syllabus, right, for A levels. So, how good is your memory? Well, let's ask some questions. What did you eat for dinner 7 days ago? Any of you remember? Even I can't remember, and I'm teaching the subject. Well, here's an interesting thing to think about, right? If you forget something, is it gone forever? Or is it just somewhere at the back of your brain cells and just needs a trigger to help you remember what it is, right? What do you need to recall what you ate 1 week ago, right? Let's say you wrote it down in your diary, or perhaps you put it down in a calendar, right? On this day, 1 week ago, I ate, chicken pie, right? And if you had written it down, you can probably remember the memory of eating the chicken pie. Why? Because you have a trigger, right? So memory is a really interesting thing, right? Where we put our attention, that tends to be where our memory is strongest, right? The more attention, the stronger the memory. Now, when we talk about the cognitive approach in psychology, this is about processes in our minds that affect our behavior, right? It ignores biology and genetics, right? So there's a biological approach as well. We don't really consider biology when we think about cognition, right? We're thinking about how people think, how they process information, that kind of thing. Now, there are some basic concepts that are usually common in all psychology studies that come under cognition, which is attention, memory, decision making, and language, right? These are some of the things that are very common themes in cognitive psychological experiments. Now, what is social cognition? Social cognition is how people process social information, right? So let's say you're at a party, people are smiling and joking. How do you process that information? There are actually a lot of different cues going on. You have to process the tone of voice that people have, the jokes that they're making. Do you look at their eyes? How do you react to their body? What are you thinking about what they're saying and stuff like that? There's a lot of information to process, right? And that all happens as part of our cognition. Right? Now, the cognitive view takes a very mechanistic view of human behavior, right? A very mechanical view in a sense, right? It considers the human brain very simply like a computer, right? That's the simplest analogy to understand how the cognitive approach is like. I always remember this scene from the Avengers, right? The scene where Tony Stark is showing Dr. Banner how he's got his Jarvis on the left, and on the right is that sort of like the brain, quote unquote, from the crystal, right? And it shows how it's thinking, right? So that's kind of like, an illustration from a movie about how the brain is kind of like a computer. It's thinking, right? It's processing information, similar to how a computer does, right? This image I took from the textbook. So input is your keyboard, your mouse, your joystick. You key in information to your computer processes that information, and then output is the screen printer sound, right? It shows you stuff. Similar to a human being, right? Input is the sensory information you have from your senses, sight, sound, touch, smell, whatever. And your output is your behavior, right? Your reaction after you've processed it in your brain. What do you do with that information, right? So, something interesting that I like to ask my students, do you think in the future one day we'll be able to integrate human brain cells like the neuron onto microchips? And because the reason being, because we're trying to develop faster and faster computers. Now, computers are really fast at calculating hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions, if not trillions of different mathematical processes at the same time, right? That's what they're good at doing, right? But in terms of things like, let's say, recognizing a face, right? That's something that humans are far more faster at, right? Excuse me, I'm phrasing my words all terribly this afternoon, but humans are a lot faster at processing things like faces. Whereas for a computer, to process a face, it has to scan your facial features, run it through its database, and it tries to find, the criminal, let's say, for example, like we've seen in all these Hollywood movies where they can find a criminal just by looking at your face and stuff like that, and cross-referencing it with the database. But humans, we just look at the face immediately. Oh, well, this is my friend John from high school, you know what I mean? So we're a lot faster. We do it almost immediately, and that's something that computers are still unable to do, right? But when it comes to calculating stuff, yeah, computers are much faster than us. So would there be a possibility in the future, maybe combining them both and creating a superhuman computer hybrid? Well, you never know. It might happen, right? Anyway, let's talk a bit more about attention. That's really important for this study. There are two types of attention, broadly speaking: focused attention and divided attention, right? Now, focused attention is when you pick out specific information in your surroundings. Let's say at your party, right? At a party, someone calls your name from across the room. you're most likely going to hear them and you're going to respond. Even though there's so many different sounds and everybody's having different kinds of conversations about everything under the sun and there's music playing, but the moment someone says your name, you always hear and you turn around and you say like, hey, what's up, right? This is focused attention. In fact, in the background of our brains, it seems like there's a dedicated part of our brain that seems to just specifically pay attention when our name is called, right? Or even something, that's particularly important, like a fire alarm, a car alarm, or something. When there's something important in your surroundings that your attention is looking out for, you tend to focus in on it, right? And you ignore everything else. The moment someone calls your name, suddenly you can't hear the music, you can't hear other people's conversation, nothing. You just listen to what that person is saying because they called your name. Right? There's also divided attention. Now, this is when you have to split your mental effort. A good example is when you're sitting in the car and you're having a conversation, right? Part of your attention is on driving, and the other part of your attention is on talking to the person next to you, right? So that's divided attention, a splitting of the mental effort, right? Let's look a little bit more about divided attention. So driving a car, that's called your primary task or your main task, right? That's the most important task that you have to do. Driving the car, pressing your foot on the pedal, moving the steering wheel, pushing on your lights, looking at the road, right? So that's the primary task. Now, what about talking to someone, right? That's known as the concurrent task, right? So there's a primary task and a concurrent. Concurrent means happening at the same time. Right? So you're driving, that's your main focus. However, you're also holding a conversation with someone, right? That's your concurrent focus. And for those of you who drive, you've probably noticed this before. When you first started learning how to drive, it was probably really difficult for you to hold a conversation while driving. I know it was really difficult for me. My mom would be trying to talk to me about stuff and I'd just say, Mom, just be quiet for a moment. I need to focus, right? Especially if it's something difficult like, navigating through a difficult turn or trying to park, right? I'd always tell someone, keep quiet. In fact, we do it even when we're listening to music, right? I don't know if you've noticed this, but while you're driving and you're listening to music, let's say you get lost or you're looking for a particular place but you're not sure where it is exactly. And as you're looking around and you're listening to music, you tend to turn the music down a little bit because you want to focus on like the road signs and trying to focus. And I've done it so many times that until I read this journal and I paid attention to my behavior, and I was like, wow, that really does happen, right? So sometimes there's because we're dividing our attention, right? Our attention needs to fight for two different tasks. So it's switching really quickly between these two tasks. Now, you've probably heard this word multitasking. Now, previously, people used to think that it was possible for our brain to do two tasks simultaneously, right? Is it possible? Well, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that actually we can't multitask in the way that people believed it previously. What we can do is that we can switch our attention really quickly between two tasks, right? So that's possible. If you want to know more, you can actually check out videos like this online. This is called the Monkey Business Illusion. It's by Daniel J. Simmons. It's a wonderful video, really. I think it will cause quite a paradigm shift in people's beliefs about their attention, right? I won't give away the interesting thing about this video, but go and search it up on YouTube, right? The Monkey Business Illusion. You can even check out Mr. Daniel J. Simmons' website, right? Daydreaming. Let's talk a little bit about daydreaming, right? So daydreaming is getting basically just lost in our thoughts, right? We're doing something mundane and suddenly we start dreaming about, flying like Iron Man or relaxing on the beach with a cocktail, right? Now, interestingly enough, daydreaming is usually positive, right? Very rarely do you hear cases of people having nightmares when they're daydreaming, right? That happens when we sleep at night sometimes, right? We get nightmares, but daydreaming tends to be rather positive. I think that's a pretty interesting thought, right? It also has this kind of sense of detachment, right? You may be in your office, you may be doing some office work, and then suddenly you're just daydreaming and you're it's almost as if you're not there in the office anymore, right? There's a sense of detachment from your material surrounding, right? What about doodling, right? So there's daydreaming, now there's doodling. What is doodling? Well, doodling is to draw pictures or patterns while thinking about something else or when you're bored, right? That's from the Cambridge Dictionary Online. That's just a picture of an egg with a doodle on it. That's not really doodling. Doodling is more like, some sort of like random things that you doodle at the side of your paper when you're bored in class or something like that, right? If it's a focused task, it's not really doodling, right? So if you're doing a piece of artwork, right, you're painting something or you're drawing a picture, that's not really doodling, right? Doodling is sort of like kind of like random and you're just moving your hand and whatever comes to mind, right? So daydreaming versus doodling, right? Let's look at the differences. So When it comes to daydreaming, you use a greater central executive functioning part of your brain, right? More cognitive resources are required because daydreaming, is like as if you're really dreaming, and dreaming is a very intense activity for the human mind, right? You have to think about a lot of things. You're imagining stuff. You could be completely visualizing yourself in a completely different situation. That sense of detachment, right? So that has a higher cognitive load on the brain, right? It needs more cognitive resources. Whereas with doodling, it's more of a visual spatial task, right? It doesn't require your senses to be fully activated. You don't hear things when you doodle, right? Whereas when you're daydreaming, you might imagining stuff, right? So it's just purely just drawing. It's more visual spatial. So for example, let's say you're listening to a lecture, right? You're listening to a lecture and you start daydreaming. Would you miss out things in the lecture, right? Does the daydreaming affect that? Or let's say you're listening to a lecture and you start doodling, right? Would you be able to pay attention to the lecture and doodle at the same time? What do you think? Well, we're going to be looking at a bit more in detail with regards to this current study and how daydreaming versus doodling, how doodling might actually be helpful for our attention and our memory. Right? Some past studies by Doe and Charlotte in 2004. So daydreaming was linked to high arousal, especially when you're bored, right? It really high arousal, especially in the brain, right? Doodling, however, can help concentration by reducing daydreaming, right? Because daydreaming uses a lot of cognitive resources. And like I said earlier, if you're in a lecture and you're daydreaming, your teacher has probably scolded you before, hey, stop daydreaming, pay attention, right? Because you tend not to be able to pay attention to a lecture when you're daydreaming. Doodling might help, right? Because it reduces daydreaming. Wilson and Korn in 2007, they found that doodling may actually help to maintain arousal. So let's say you're bored in class, you're feeling a bit sleepy, right? So by doodling, by drawing stuff at the side of your paper, your notebook, right? That might actually help keep you awake, right? Some level of arousal is required. And it might also help reduce arousal. Let's say if you're agitated, right? You're feeling a bit flustered today, you're feeling, particularly anxious maybe, or you're agitated for some reason. You start doodling and that kind of like calms you down a bit because it's like an attention, it's sort of like it's a task to focus a bit on, right? So that's interesting, right? If you're agitated, it can help calm you down. If you're tired, it could help you maintain a higher level of arousal. So that's pretty interesting. What's a research gap? Well, this study claims to be the first experimental test known to the author on the prediction that doodling aids concentration, right? So doodling helps concentration. That's basically, or rather, so to speak, the author believes that they're the first ones to experiment on the idea whether doodling does indeed aid concentration or not. Right, so the aim of the study is, does doodling help information processing by either enabling people to attend more effectively or enhancing their memory, right? So does doodling help you increase your attention, or does it somehow enhance your memory? Right. Hypotheses, right? Doodling helps with information processing. So what kind of research method and design are we talking about? Is it a lab experiment? Is it a quasi-experiment? Is it a survey? Well, if you read the journal before watching this video, you know the answer, right? What is it? Let me give you a hint. There's a lot of control, there's an IV, there's a DV. It is indeed a laboratory experiment, right? So what are the characteristics of a laboratory experiment, right? It's got to have an IV, got to have a DV, it's got to have some levels of control, and it has to have random allocation. So that's really important, right? Your participants need to be randomly allocated to groups. Now, we've got between subjects or within subjects. What design do you think this experiment had? Well, if you read the journal, you know what the answer is. What is it? It is a between subjects design, right? So what does that mean? That simply means that all the participants went through one level of the IV only, right? They did not go to two levels of the IV. Right? What's the IV here? It's doodling, right? There are two different levels of the IV, the doodling condition and the no doodling condition or the control, right? What about the DV? DV is memory recall, all right? In this case, the DV could be monitored information or, monitored information in this case is the names of the party goers, or incidental information, which is the names of places, right? We'll talk a bit more that in a bit more detail. Essentially, they listened to a recording and they either had to remember the names of places and the names of people. What's the operational definition? Well, a correct answer was defined as a correct answer minus the false alarms, which is equivalent to the final score. Let me explain a bit more in detail. A correct answer would be the name of someone going to the party, right? I asked you to remember the names of people going to the party, and you remember the name, right? A false alarm, however, was a name in the recording but was not going to the party. So let's say I had three names, Aaron, Benjamin, and John, and only Aaron and Benjamin are going to the party, but John isn't, right? But if you had said John in the answer booklet, then they would take that and minus it from your correct answers in order to get the final score. Now, there was mishearings. Mishearings basically talks about where people heard a certain name like Greg, but instead, they wrote the word Greg, the name Greg, instead of Craig, right? So Craig was the name in the recording, let's say for example, but they misheard it and they put Greg instead. So the authors considered these answers as correct if the name written down was similar enough to the original name in the recording, right? It could have been that the person just maybe did not hear it properly, but got the gist of the name and wrote down something that sounds phonetically similar enough, right? So that was considered correct, right? If it was a mishearing, it was considered correct if the authors believed that the name was similar enough to the actual name in the recording. What about names that were ignored? So this was, for example, if someone said sister or Craig's sister, that would be ignored, right? Sister would not be considered as a correct answer, right? It would just be completely ignored. Counterbalancing. Now, counterbalancing is often used as a control procedure to help reduce the risk of order effects in a within subjects design. So there was counterbalancing in this study. However, you might be wondering, wait a minute, counterbalancing is usually in a within subjects design, right? It's a measure of control. But this study is a between subject study, isn't it? I just said that a few minutes ago. Well, that's right. It is a between subjects. So counterbalancing is not used in the IVs of this study. In most cases, counterbalancing helps to reduce the order effects of the IVs, right, in a particular study, and that's why it's a within subjects, because we have to mix up the way that people go into an experimental condition, right? Each participant has to go through both the conditions in a different order, right? I think it's a bit hard to verbally explain it. Let me try and visually explain it. But just remember this, the counterbalancing that's going on in this study by Andrade is with regards to the DV instead of the IV, right? So let me show you. The counterbalancing was on the memory recall, right, the DV. So half the participants would first have to recall the name of partygoers. And then after that, they were asked to recall the name of places. The other half of participants would recall the name of places first, followed by the name of partygoers second, right? So can you see how they've counterbalanced it? They've mixed up the order so that the order is equally sort of like the opposite, right? One group goes to the first one, names first, and then places. The second group goes through places first and then names, right? So this is what we call as counterbalancing. Again, counterbalancing usually is for the IV. In this case, it is for the DV. Now this, again, for the DV, right? So materials, we had a tape recording, which was 2.5 minutes long. 227 WPM stands for words per minute. So it was read in a monotonous voice. So these are important notes that you should memorize for your exam, right? It was read at a comfortable volume, right? In the recording, there were 8 names of people who were attending a fictional party. 3 names of people were not attending, but the names were mentioned in the recording. There was 1 cat, right, who was not attending. 8 names of places, which were in the recording as well, and lots of irrelevant details, right? If you want to see what the recording is like, you can actually check it out in the appendix of the study. So for example, hi, are you doing anything on Saturday? I'm having a birthday party and was hoping you could come. It's not actually my birthday, it's my sister Jane's, right? She'll be 21. She's coming from London for the weekend and so on and so forth. You can see the names are in bold and the places are in italic, right? Materials, right? So there's a paper and a pencil given to all participants, right? The doodling group were given a paper and that sort of looked like this, right? I took a screenshot of this picture from another YouTube video, CIE A-Level Psychology. Unfortunately, that YouTube video is no longer available. But essentially, there were some squares and circles for people to shade in for the doodling group, and also a blank space with a certain margin on the left. Right? The control group, however, were given lined paper, right? Lined paper that looked like that. So, question. Why would the experimenter give different types of paper to both groups of participants, right? The doodling group received an A4 paper with some circles and squares, whereas the control group received lined paper. Why do you think that might be? Give it a thought. Right, the reason why is probably because lined paper discourages doodling from happening. Right, remember the control group is the group that should not be doodling. We don't want them to doodle anything. And that's why lined paper was given, because people tend to write words on lined paper. We don't usually draw on lined paper. Of course, some people do, but generally we draw on blank A4 paper, right? If you've ever doodled before, you kind of know that it's almost like instinctive that your pen and your pencil start looking for things, rather start looking for a blank space on the paper before you start doodling, right? So that's why they were given A4 paper rather than lined paper in the doodling group, because we wanted to encourage them to doodle and also to write down stuff. Now, again, I should remind you that the doodling group was required to shade in, right? Excuse me, I made a slight error before. They were required to shade in rather than just doodle freely. So doodling in this case was defined as the shading in that they would do on the shapes provided, right? That's one of the ways that they standardize doodling, right? Otherwise, doodling could be quite random, right? Some people might doodle, some people might not. But by giving them the shaded pieces, then at least they could guarantee that pretty much all the participants would doodle, right? Or in this case, shading. Okay, sample, there were 40 people, okay, 18 to 55 years, quite a pretty large age range, 15 females and 5 males, so there's a slight bias there. They were all members of a medical research council, which means that they're familiar with things like psychological studies and participating in research, right? They're pretty familiar with this, okay. One participant, oh, excuse me, sorry, I went a little bit too quickly over there. Let me fast forward it. Right, go back to my sample page. Right, so sample again. So one participant in the doodling condition did not doodle and was replaced. Okay, that's all you needed to know. Procedure, participants were recruited immediately after another experiment. So they finished another experiment and then the researcher went up to them and said, hey, do you mind spending a few minutes? Could you help me do this study, right? They were tested individually in a dull room, right? They were given general instructions and also given paper, plus special instructions only for the doodling condition, right? So the general instructions were the same for both groups, but the doodling condition group naturally got some special instructions. Right? So why were they recruited immediately after another experiment? Well, remember this is about doodling, right? And we kind of want them to be bored, or rather the researcher wants them to be bored because we want them to doodling. We want them to doodle. Doodling is something that we usually do when we're bored, right? But how do we make people feel bored? Well, think about it this way. Imagine you just participated in an experiment and you're probably a bit tired and you want to go home, right? And that's your focus, right? You just want to go home and enjoy the rest of your day. And then suddenly this researcher comes up to you and says, hey, do you mind helping me in another experiment? And so on. And you're like, oh, okay, fine, I'll help you. But you may not be in the most interested frame of mind, right? You're probably a little bit bored. At the same time, why did they test them in an why did they test them in a dull room? Well, probably for the same reason, rather, that they wanted the participants to be bored. So they didn't want anything colorful or distracting in the room. They just wanted a boring room so that boredom would be induced in the participants. Okay. Procedure. So they listened to the recording and they wrote down the names of party goers, right? So that was an instruction that they had to write down the names of the party goers. Now, what happened was after the experiment was over, they apologized for the deception because, as you know, this experiment actually has a surprise memory test. A surprise! They actually tested their memory, right? They did not know that this was happening. So there was counterbalancing, as I mentioned earlier. Counterbalancing was involved at this part of the study, which was the surprise memory test. During the debriefing, they also asked the participants, did you suspect a memory test? So why was it a surprise test? Because we wanted to test whether or not they were able to memorize the names of places as well as the names of the partygoers, right? And if they knew there was a test coming up, they would probably spend a little bit more effort trying very hard to memorize the names, but we don't want them to do that, right? We wanted them to just write it down. We just didn't tell them that we're going to test them on it, right? At the same time, there was a debriefing where they asked the participants if they suspected a memory test. And the reason why this is done is because if you suspected while you were doing the experiment that there was going to be a memory test at the end of it, you might be unconsciously or consciously paying a bit more attention to what you have to do, right? The names of the people in your task. And so we don't want that to happen. We want them to not pay too much attention and purposely try very hard to memorize. That's kind of like an extraneous variable. right? We don't want that happening. So that's why they asked participants, did you suspect anything? Remember, these participants participate in research, right? They're used to this. So some of them could have guessed, and we'll see later if they did. So names is the names of partygoers, and places is the names of places. So if you see me just put names, it's the names of partygoers, places, names of places. So question, what is the primary task? Remember that example I gave of primary and concurrent task when it comes to driving a car and having a conversation. So primary task here is monitoring the telephone message, right? So they were asked to monitor the telephone message, to listen to it, and to write down the names of particles. What is the concurrent task? The concurrent task is doodling, right? It's doodling. So this is the table that's taken from the study itself. You can look at the bold text, right, which is the numbers for memory score and the control condition, 4.0, 1.5 in brackets is the standard deviation, compared to doodling, 5.1 and 1.7. So immediately you can see that doodling had a higher mean for the memory score of names, which is monitored information, whereas for places, which is incidental information, the memory score for the doodling group was also higher, right? 2.4 to 1.8, right? So just looking at the mean scores, you can kind of see that the doodling group performed better, right? Let's look at the results in more detail. So when it comes to doodling behavior, they measured the mean number of shaded shapes, which was a mean of 36.3, right? They counted how many different squares and circles were shaded in. Mean was 36.3. What about the range? Range was from anywhere from 3 to 110. That's a lot of shading going on, right? So one participant shaded only 3 shapes, another participant 110. A lot of individual differences here. What about the control group? Control group, thankfully, there was no doodling at all going on. Remember, that's why they gave them the lined paper to discourage doodling, right? So what were the results? The mean results for names, right? Question 1, which group remembered more names? So we're going to look at the numbers first. Let's look at the mean here, 7.8 for doodling, control is 7.1. So question, which group remembered more names? Quite clearly, it was the doodling condition, right? 7.8 to 7.1. False alarms, 1 person in the doodling condition, and false alarms, 5 people in the control condition had false alarms, right? Managed to memorize all 8 names, 15 in the doodling condition, and only 9 in the control condition. So quite clearly, doodling condition did better, right? What about mean results for overall? So just now was just the names. Now we're adding the names and the places together, right? So the mean again, 7.5 to 5.8. Doodling condition much higher, right, in terms of mean. But how much percentage better did the doodling group do versus the control group? So in terms of percentage, 7.5 compared to 5.8, you get a total of 29% better, right? The doodling condition did 29% better overall in their mean recall for names and places. Results. Okay, so let's look at more results. Monitoring the names of partygoers, the doodling group had a mean of 7.7 with a standard deviation of 0.6. Okay. Comparing this with the control condition, which had a mean of 6.9 and a standard deviation of 1.3. Now, monitoring performance in the doodling condition was significantly higher than the control conditions, right? So we can't just look at the means, we have to look at whether or not it's significant at the 0.05 level, whether we are 95% certain that the results that we're getting is due to the IV and not due to chance. Right? And so these results were actually significant at the P 0.01 level, right? So we have 99% certainty, which is really good. What does the standard deviation mean? Well, standard deviation is kind of like the spread of scores, right? How far they are spread around the mean. If you look at the doodling group, the standard deviation is smaller, right? 0.6 compared to the control group of 1.3. That means the scores of the control group are a lot more spread out. Right? There's a lot more variance, whereas in the doodling group, the scores are less spread out. There's less variance, which means that most of the scores are closer to the mean. Right? And if the mean is 7.7, well, we know that the total number of correct answers is 8. So the mean of the group was 7.7 and there's less variance. So majority of the participants were actually scoring almost full marks, right? Almost all correct answers for the monitoring of names. Other results that were in the study, names were better recalled than places for both groups overall. Reason why this might be is simply because, well, we asked them to monitor the names, right? Both groups, both the control condition and the doodling condition, were instructed to write down the names, right? The groups in the control condition wrote them on the lined paper. The groups in the doodling condition wrote them down on the margin at the side of that paper, right? So it makes sense that, the names were better recalled than places because names was what they had to monitor. Right? Why? Then doodlers recalled names and places better than the control group, right? So remember, the places was not something that was informed to the participants, right? That was part of the deception. We didn't tell them that we're going to test them on the places mentioned in the study, in the recording rather. So the doodlers actually did better when we saw the results for names and places compared to the control. P is equal to 0.02. The finding was significant even after removing suspicious participants. So remember earlier at the debriefing, they asked the participants, hey, any of you were suspicious of a memory test? Did you expect anything? Yes, they removed those participants. Why did they remove them? Well, because that's kind of like a confounding variable. We don't want people who kind of know our aim, right? That's a demand characteristic. We don't want them to behave in a way that fulfills the experiment condition, right? We don't want them to do that. We want them to behave naturally, right? How many were removed? A total of 3 from the doodling condition and a total of 4 from the control condition. And after removing a total of 7 people, the results were still significant, right? So that's good, right? Conclusion, doodling improves concentration on a primary task, right? At the same time, we can also say that doodling group was better than the control group on recalling monitored and incidental information, right? When it came to memorizing the names recalling the names of people and places, right? The doodling group performed significantly better than the control group, right? This could be due to the effect of attention increasing, right? You notice more words when you're doodling, or perhaps doodling helps memory by encouraging deeper processing, right? The only issue with this study is that we're not entirely sure which one of these mechanisms is the reason why doodling is actually helping the recall, right? We don't know whether it's actually the attention that's increasing, or could it be that memory is being affected due to a deeper processing that's happening. We don't know for certain, but the author narrowed it down to possibly these two factors, right? A problem in this study is that they did not measure daydreaming, right? Remember earlier we talked about the difference between doodling and daydreaming? It would have been great if the researcher managed to measure daydreaming people, but that's something that's a bit tricky. How do you manipulate people to daydream, right? It's something that happens rather spontaneously and sporadically, right? It's something that you can't really manipulate. You can't really tell someone, I want you to daydream now, right? That does not work, right? Then they're just imagining stuff on command. So anyway, that's one of the weaknesses of the study. They did not measure daydreaming, so they can't really make a comparison between how daydreaming may have affected memory versus doodling. In addition to that, during the deception, the researcher did not ask the participants, hey, did any of you daydream, right? Let's say, for example, that they did, right? What if so then if the doodlers were daydreaming as well as doodling, then it's possible that the daydreaming may have been assisting them in recalling the information better. But we didn't ask them that question, so we don't know if daydreaming could have been playing a role here. Let's quickly discuss the strengths and weaknesses. So this was an experiment. Was there randomization? Yes, there was, right? So random allocation of groups. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Most of us would say it's a good thing. It's a strength, right? Because you want to randomly allocate them, make sure that the allocation is fair. That's the most scientifically accurate way of allocating people, right? By random, so that there's no bias in terms of who gets allocated to whichever group, right? We try to control for individual differences that way by randomly allocating my participants, right? Control over the IV. Was there any control in this experiment? Indeed, there was. How did they try to control the IV? Was by making sure one group was encouraged to doodle and one group was discouraged from doodling, right? By giving them the line paper, and the other group had the paper with the boxes so they could shade it in. Right? Extraneous variables in this study? Well, there are a lot of different kinds of things that you have to consider, right? How the mood might have been, how participants might have been, what about the conditions of the experiment. However, do keep in mind that the experiment was made to be a boring condition, right, in order to stimulate boredom so that they would be more inclined to doodle. But remember, that could have also caused them to daydream, right? So that could have been an extraneous variable or any other variables that you can think of which could have affected the relationship between the IV and the DV, right? But they do try to control it as best as possible. Validity and reliability, the operational definition is pretty clear, right? Correct answers minus false alarms equals the total score. So that's pretty clear what the operational definition was. What if someone had misheard a name or misspelled the name? Would that be considered correct? What if they had written extra information? Would that be ignored? and all that, right? So the operational definition is quite clear in order to make sure that the measurements are valid. Reliability, what about standardization? Was the procedure standardized? Indeed it was. All participants went through the same procedure in their own experimental condition, whether it was control or the doodling group. Everything was standardized, the instructions were standardized, the papers were standardized, the recording was standardized, so you can talk about all of that in terms of reliability and replicability, right? Participant variables, right? So doodling, we saw the doodling range from 3 to 110. That's a big variance, right, in the amount of doodling. So there are a lot of different participants variables that could be affecting the study, right? Think along the lines of individual versus situational, right? They're all in the same situation, which is a boring situation, but individual differences could have explained the fact that some of them doodle less and some of them doodle more. Now, could that be an issue? What do you think? It might be an issue because maybe do those who doodle more memorize things better, or rather recall things better, or to those who doodle less, could that be affecting their memory recall? We don't know for certain, right? So that is a variable in the study that could be a weakness, right? Demand characteristics, as we saw, there were 7 suspicious participants indeed. So there was possibly something in the way the research was designed that gave away the aims, that people guessed that, there's probably going to be a memory test after this. Or it could also be the fact that these participants come from a research council, so they're familiar with these kind of experiments, right? But yes, so demand characteristics would be a weakness in this study. But remember, they did try to control it by removing those participant scores, and the results were still significant, right? Generalizability, what can we talk about the sample? The age range from 18 years of age to 55, pretty big range, so that's good. You get to capture a lot of people, more representative. Sample bias, in terms of bias, we saw that they were all from the same research council, so there's a bias there. They may all suspect certain research practices. At the same time, they were all, so there were more females than males, right? There was a slight gender bias, so that might be something you want to talk about in terms of weaknesses, right? Can't generalize to both genders equally because there was a gender bias. Data, there was pretty much just quantitative data in this study. Number of shaded doodles, that was quantitative, numerical, objective. There's no bias when it comes to interpreting that. When it comes to the results, no bias in terms of the correct answers, right? Minus the false alarms equals the total score, right? There's no researcher bias involved there. There's no interpretation required. You can compare between conditions really easily. You can summarize, you can computate, you can statistically analyze. So those are all the strengths of quantitative and objective data, right? But the problem is that you don't get any in-depth detail, right? We don't really know what's going on in the participant's mind, what they're thinking about. So that's one of the weaknesses of quantitative data. Ethics, right? Was this an ethical experiment? Did they have fully informed consent? Well, no, they didn't. Why? Because they had a deception in the study where they did not reveal the full aims of the experiment, which kind of makes sense, right? There's an argument for it because the memory test had to be a surprise, right? In order for them to make sure that the participants were not going to purposely memorize or spend a lot of their attention on memorizing, they had to make sure that that was a surprise. So it lacked fully informed consent. However, and also there was deception, right? And that's unethical because people have the right to know the aims and procedure of a study before agreeing to participate, right? If you want their consent. However, they did have debriefing, right? Was there debriefing? Yes, there was. So debriefing is the measure that's taken to control for this unethical procedure. And they explained everything to the participant and they make sure that they know what the true aim of the experiment really is, right? Could there have been any psychological distress when we test participants for their memory recall? Suddenly I say that, hey, guess what? You're going to have to memorize you're going to have to recall the names of places as well. Too bad we didn't tell you earlier, but you're going to have to do it anyway. The participant might feel very uncomfortable saying, oh no, I didn't memorize the names. Oh, what if I get it wrong? And that might be causing a bit of distress in the subject. So that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching. I forgot to put my last slide, which is the end slide. But nonetheless, hope you guys enjoyed this little overview of the Andrade doodling study. If you have any questions, comments, please do let me know in the comments below. You can send me an email. At the same time, do like, comment, and subscribe, right, to support my little channel. I don't earn anything specifically from doing these videos, but if you want to support me on Patreon, you can check out my details in the comment section below. Once again, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time with our next study. Bye-bye.